LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, do your emotions make you smarter?
Do you know a lot about emotions and feelings? Great! Then you're ready to play Name That Emotion!
This is a clip from a 2015 episode of Sesame Street.
Bring in the first contestant!
Contestant? I'm not playing a game.
Seems to be a grouch.
Yeah.
Let's see, Mr. Grouch, can you tell us a little bit about how you're feeling?
I'm not telling you nothing.
Well, don't you want to play our game?
No, I don't want to play your game.
Seems like he's cranky and a little bit grumpy. How do you think this grouch is feeling? Grouchy? You think the grouch is grouchy? Let's find out. Mr. Grouch, are you grouchy?
Of course I'm grouchy. I'm a grouch.
We did it! We need that emotion!
No!
Thank you for playing, Mr. Grouch!
Now, this clip is silly, of course, but it's also kind of remarkable. The average Sesame Street viewer is 3 years old. They can't read. They can't ride a bike. They can't do their taxes. But they can recognize and name their own feelings and correctly label the emotions of other people or puppets. We are highly sensitive, emotional beings, for better and for worse. Yet almost as soon as we learn to identify our feelings, we're told we need to learn to manage them, lest they get the best of us or cloud our judgment. Our emotions are a problem to be solved. This line of thinking, that emotions are inconvenient, a pebble in the shoe of rationality, extends from the 21st century all the way back to Darwin and Plato. But what if our emotions aren't a problem to be solved? What if they exist to help us solve problems? That's the striking conclusion scientists have come to in the last decade. Emotions, as they now understand them, don't hinder rational thought, they enhance it. Think of scouts in the army. They go out in front of the other troops, scope out what's up ahead, and then run back to camp to share what they've found. Our emotions do something similar. They race out in front of our rational thinking, and they bring back intel that fuels our thought processes. Every emotion, whether it's fear or disgust, anger or surprise, sharpens a particular set of beliefs and memories and senses, while simultaneously downplaying others. That's why it's impossible to separate emotion and logic. This new understanding of the relationship between thinking and feeling came to my attention when we had the brilliant science writer Annie Murphy-Paul on the show to talk about her book, The Extended Mind. Annie shared some incredible research that shows stockbrokers who follow their guts make smarter trades. It's because your unconscious mind can do all sorts of complex mental calculations that your conscious mind can't keep up with. I encountered that research again in an exciting new book by theoretical physicist Leonard Mlodinow. It's called Emotional: How Feelings Shape Our Thinking. And so I thought, given their shared interests, why not get Annie to interview Len about his book? That's what you're about to hear. But you're still going to hear from me too. Annie and Len's conversation was so interesting that as my producer Caleb and I listened back to it, we kept pausing to talk about other anecdotes from the book and geek out on some of the science. We had such a blast that we thought we'd try incorporating some of our back and forth into the episode itself. Kind of like the director's commentary on a DVD. Remember those? Anyway, I'm so grateful to Annie and Len for having this conversation and for completely changing my understanding of where emotions come from, what purpose they serve, and how they enhance our thinking.
From LinkedIn News, I'm Leah Smart, and this is Everyday Better. Join me every week to explore the stories and ideas that show us how we can live even better every single day with people who are changing the world. Tune in to my weekly podcast, Everyday Better, wherever you like to listen.
Okay, Rufus, before we get to Annie and Len's conversation, I'm going to ask you some questions. and I want you to answer them on a scale from 1 to 6. 1 means you strongly disagree, 6 means you strongly agree.
Okay.
First question, do you think you look attractive?
Caleb, attractive to whom? We're talking to like passersby on the street, to my wife.
To Uber drivers. I think to yourself. I think to yourself when you look in the mirror in the morning.
Well, I'm really highly attractive to myself, but I would say to my wife, I'm going to say a 4 out of 6.
Okay. Here's another one. Would you say that you are intensely interested in other people?
That's an easy one. A 6 out of 6. People are fascinating.
Yeah, I feel like if you hosted an interview podcast and you were not interested in other people, that would be kind of a problem.
It would make the job a lot less fun, for sure.
Okay, let me give you one more. Is there a gap between what you would like to do and what you have done?
Interesting. There is a gap. So I'm gonna go with a 3 out of 6 on this because I would like there to be a gap in that there's a lot more I'd like to do. So 3 out of 6.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so those questions come from a survey that Len includes in his book, Emotional. And the survey is to help you better understand your emotional disposition. And it's one of the things I think is great about this book and about the conversation that we're about to play with Len and Annie, that yes, they get into all the fascinating science of where emotions come from and how they work and stuff like that. But they also talk about emotions on a really practical and personal level. And so I thought it would be fun to have you take the rest of that survey offline, and then we can come back at the end of the episode, we can talk about your results, and we can connect them to some of the insights and tools that Annie and Len are about to share.
Fantastic. I'm game. So let's get into Annie and Len's conversation. They began by discussing our futile efforts to separate thinking and feeling.
Len, it was really interesting reading this book as someone who, fairly recently finished this book on the extended mind, which is pushing back against the way that we tend to separate, the mind from the body, the mind from our physical surroundings, the mind from relationships with other people. And another big division in our culture, obviously, is the way we tend to separate mental life, intellectual life from emotions. And I felt like your book was a really strong statement saying that's not right. We know that's not correct. And there's all this new science that is showing us how misguided that notion is. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, about why it is or how it came to be that we separate thinking from feeling and why that separation really is not sustainable.
Well, it dates back at least to Plato and the ancient Greeks who thought that you have a rational mind for logical thought that makes good decisions and guides you. And then you have these drives and passions that you need to fulfill, but that overtake your reason sometimes. And the Christian philosophers after Plato put an element of morality into it. And as the idea proceeded through the ages, it became embedded in Western culture that there's a split, that there's a rational mind and there's an emotional mind, and that the rational mind is good and makes good decisions, and the emotional mind leads you astray, and the rational mind has to control it. And we now know that is like way not true. I mean, first of all, we may use the term rational mind and emotional mind figuratively, but there is no rational mind and an emotional mind. Not only are there in the brain, is that all mixed up and interconnected, but in fact, in the operation of our rational and emotional apparatus and our rational thought, it's inextricable. They are tied together in a way that cannot be separated. So there is no separation. And important point about that, the most important point is that the role that the emotions play is constructive and not a destructive role. Without our emotions, we not only wouldn't make generally good decisions, we wouldn't make any decisions. We would hardly do anything because motivation comes from your feelings. Without any feelings, without any desires, any joy, any happiness, or any sadness or threat of sadness or anxiety, we would just sit there doing nothing, waiting for some stimulus to respond to. But that's the way people view it in culture, that they think that you can separate pure, rational, logical, computer-like processing from emotion, and it's just not true.
You have a chapter in your book titled The Purpose of Emotion, and I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that, because I think people might wonder, why do we have these emotions that sort of buffet us in one direction or another? Why can't we just sort of think like computers in this completely clear-headed, logical way. Why do emotions exist? What are they for?
Well, emotions developed like the rest of us when we were living in the wild in nomadic groups of 20, 30, 40, 50 individuals. And they evolved as a way to help us efficiently respond to threats in the environment or potential gains in the environment, food or whatever. To appreciate the role of emotion, you have to think about what would thinking be like if there was no emotion. One kind of thinking is reflexive thinking, which most animals exercise most of the time, which is there's a certain stimulus that causes a certain response. And that's very rigid. Your brain would have an encyclopedia of different stimuli to react to and what you should do if that happens, called reflexive thinking or fixed action patterns. And that works quite well because as the animal evolves, it evolves a very intelligent response to certain stimuli. But if you encounter new stimuli or altered stimuli, it doesn't work so well. So we've evolved also logical rational thinking, whereby you analyze a situation. But that's rather slow, and our, as you know, because I know it's in your book, our consciousness can only handle a certain amount of data per second, and it's not really the most efficient way to think. So we involve these emotions to help us do that. And what emotions are a functional state of your brain that envelops or puts a context around the logical processing. Let me give you an example. A brain is an information processor. It gets data in. It has goals that are programmed that it wants to achieve. It asks certain questions. It brings up certain memories. It makes associations. It evaluates the data according to how reliable it is and how probable certain things are, certain risks are. And all these things are happening before your logical part of your mind can start processing the information. And in all these things, other than the processing of the information, emotions are key in deciding what questions you're going to answer, formulating your goals, choosing the data that you're going to consider, bringing up whatever memories. In all these different ways, your emotions are very important. And what the emotions are is a kind of a context for that logical thinking that chooses all these parameters, that sets all the parameters of your thinking. So, for example, if you're walking down the street, a dark street in Los Angeles, downtown Los Angeles, and it's maybe a little seedy, and there's a twig breaks a couple blocks from you, you might hear that if you're in a state of fear. Because when you're in fear, your senses are heightened, you're much more goal-oriented, and you're much more focused on the environment. Your hearing acuity actually goes up. So you're in a mental state where a sound that normally would have not even registered with you does register. If you were hungry on your way to where you're going, say you're going to a restaurant, that suddenly disappears. You won't feel the hunger. It's not that you ignore the hunger. You won't feel the hunger because this fear state adjusts the parameters around which your brain is focusing.
Let's pause for a second here because I love this idea. Emotions adjust the parameters around which your brain is focusing. Sometimes that can be beneficial, but I have to think that sometimes that refocusing can actually undermine our ability to think clearly.
Yes, totally. In the book, Len cites really interesting research that Jonathan Haidt did about the ways the emotion of disgust can screw with your decision making. So Jonathan did one study where he gathered a bunch of college students and he sent them into a room, gave them a questionnaire to fill out about various moral issues, like, is it okay for first cousins to get married? But right before they went into that room, Jonathan and his colleagues doused it with fart spray, which is exactly what it sounds like. They've got like farts in a can. And what he found is that the disgust of being in that stinky room caused participants to make harsher moral judgments in the questionnaire.
This is helping me understand a lot of my last decade living with three boys, and I'm glad these three boys do not have access to this product. But that is fascinating. So emotions can be an aid, but they can also be a hindrance.
Yes, exactly. And let's get back to the interview because Annie is actually about to make that same point.
That's very interesting, Len, because that suggests that our emotional state creates a kind of context for our thinking and that we think differently depending on what emotion we're experiencing. I mean, the question that raises for me is, can we always trust our emotions to lead us in the right direction? Can we rely on them? They do seem like this finely tuned system, and yet we can all think of moments when our emotions led us to do things that we later regretted, for example.
we feel emotions many times during the day. When you think back, you tend to only remember the time where whatever you won the lottery or you got tenure or some big thing happened or you broke up with someone, a very strong emotion. But in a lower level, we feel emotions all through the day, and they really do help us process information and react to our environment. But we have to recognize, of course, that those emotions developed when we were, as I said, living in the wild, and we had a much different environment. And so they're not always appropriate to today's civilization, and especially over the last 20 years with the internet and the huge connectivity and social media and the number of humans that we come into contact with every day has just exponentially risen. So the emotions sometimes get out of hand, or they have a property, for example, called persistence, which is very important. It means it doesn't go away right away when an emotion is triggered. So if you see a bear and the bear steps off into the bushes and is no longer in sight, that emotion doesn't go away. But sometimes in modern society, situations change so quickly that persistence can carry over an emotion to a place where it's not appropriate, or we might feel an emotion that's too strong for our civilization or so forth. And it's like optical illusions. Your eyes developed to bring in information about the environment, and yet they can be fooled. And we have optical illusions, we have mirages, but no one says because there's optical illusions, we should try and not see it all. And that's similar with emotions. There are times where emotions get in the way. It's a minority of the times, but there are times when they get in the way. But it doesn't mean that we should say emotions are bad. They're still productive and constructive. And what we need to do, and I have a chapter on that, is learn how to regulate emotions. So for cases where emotion is inappropriate, or perhaps people have a disorder where they tend to feel exaggerated emotions, maybe because of events in their childhood or events even in their adulthood that have done that to them, or because of their genetics, then there are ways of handling that as well.
Was part of the reason that you thought this was the book to write right now because science is telling us some new things about emotion that we didn't know before? And what might those be?
Yeah, there's been a great revolution in emotion research over the past 10, 20 years. It's been very exciting. And I have a graph in the book showing a number of papers that mention effective neuroscience, and it just goes like that. Mm-hmm. It was stimulated, I think, in large part by new technologies to study the connectivity of the brain called the connectome. Of course, functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, optogenetics, where scientists can now go into an animal brain because it's not. It's somewhat invasive, but they can stimulate specific neurons to fire and see what they do. And it's just been an amazing explosion in research, which totally debunked the old what they call the traditional theory of emotion, which in modern times dates back to Darwin. Really, is the first scientist who did that. And we can talk about the specifics if you want, but that was a theory that came up. He published in the 1860s and really dominated thought for over 150 years, really. And we now know that almost every element of that was wrong. And it was very intuitive in many ways, just like the Greeks' ideas of atoms were intuitive, or Newton's laws are intuitive. But today we know that atoms are far different from what the Greeks thought, and also the fundamental laws of nature are far different than what Newton thought. And so similarly, all the basic tenets of the traditional theory of emotion have more or less been debunked. So one thing is about what emotion actually is. Darwin was interested, of course, as you may guess, in connecting, understanding emotion from the evolutionary point of view. And he studied other animals, mammals, and other civilizations, and came up with the theory that emotions evolved in animals to help them communicate. They don't have language, and so that in order to cooperate or fend off other animals, they have to find ways of showing their fierceness or their invitation or their happiness or their anger or whatever it was. And so they developed vocalizations and facial expressions to get that across to others of their group. And so for humans, Darwin felt that emotions were more or less outmoded because we have language and because we have rational thinking. He thought they were vestigial, somewhat like the appendix. And now we know that that is totally wrong. As I said, they're functional states of your mental processing. And so they are not vestigial. And their primary one purpose is to communicate to others, but that's not the only or the primary purpose. Darwin concluded that there were 6 basic emotions. And there was happiness, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, and disgust. And he did recognize that there were other emotions, but these were the basic ones. And now we don't make that division so much, and we look at a much wider range of emotions, a lot of social emotions, awe, embarrassment, jealousy, what they call homeostatic emotions, hunger, sexual drive, all having this quality in common that they're functional states of the brain. So, but even beyond that, it gets even worse, because we now know that those single not only should we look at a bigger spectrum of emotion, but the idea of defining emotion with a name is also a bit fuzzy. So when you say fear, it's not really, we know today, it's not really a single emotion. There are different kinds of fear. Obviously, there's different kinds of pain, right? Burning versus headache. There's different kinds of fear. And we can now we have technology that's good enough to even look at how the mechanics of that in the brain differs. People used to say that fear was in the amygdala. Remember those days, like in the 90s? The amygdala is the same as fear, okay? That's the Darwinian kind of idea that there's a certain emotion and it's in a certain place in the brain and it's indivisible, it's a unitary thing. Well, we know that the amygdala is not only involved in fear, it's involved in most emotions. And we know there's types of fear that don't even involve the amygdala. So that's wrong. So in all these ways, we found that the old standard theory doesn't work. But of course, the main thing is that emotions are useful and necessary and not counterproductive.
Right. I mean, you're going back to one thing you said about Darwin when he was arguing that for humans, we're almost beyond emotion. Like emotions are a vestige of our animal history, but we don't need those anymore. I mean, I think there's remnants of that attitude in our culture today that see emotion as something sort of primitive or not as elevated as humans' ability to engage in logic and rational thinking. I mean, do you think some of this research may sort of lead us to have more respect for emotions and for how important they are and how valuable they are?
Well, that's why I wrote the book. I hope so, but I know that it can be a long battle to change social feelings, views. There's also a huge gender difference. In my generation, males in particular were raised and told that emotion was bad. Don't cry. Don't be a wimp and cry, or don't even feel. Suppress your feelings. Women are allowed more leeway in expressing emotion, but of course, then they're criticized for it, and they go, "Oh, it's
Right.
emotional." And so this whole idea of emotion versus rationality is like male versus female, good versus bad, and it's all BS. And we have to try to change it, but it can be an uphill battle.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, to take a step into the personal here, I noticed that stories about your mother were really a kind of leitmotif through the book. And I wondered, as an author, why you made that choice and what your thinking was in sort of stringing together the pieces of the book on this thread that your mother really connects all the parts of the book.
Well, one of the trademarks or qualities of all of my books are that I tell a lot of personal stories if they're relevant. And my parents were very important, strong forces in my childhood. Of course, they are for everybody, but for me, because they both were Holocaust survivors and had very intense, dramatic experiences, that there's a lot of stories, both from the Holocaust. My father was a resistance fighter and then later in a concentration camp, and they both lost their families, siblings, parents. My father lost his wife and child. So there was just so much material there that when it's not that I go say, let's do a mother's story, but they just come to me. The book is called Emotional, and of course, the experiences that my parents had were very much emotion-based, or the effects of the experience on them had a huge effect on their emotional life. And so I guess it was just natural that when I tell stories and I want to illustrate points, my parents and especially my mother would come up, because she had such a, I think, extreme emotional life based on her unfortunate experiences. And so, so she pops up in the book. And at the end, unfortunately, there's the incident at the end that was very emotional for me as she passed away as I was finishing the book. So,
Yes.
as a writer, you try to be open and open yourself up to your innermost feelings, and so that's what I did.
Let's pause and hear a clip from the audiobook of Emotional, where Len writes about his parents.
In some families, when a child's misbehavior passes a certain threshold, they give the child a timeout, or they sit down and talk about why it is important to obey or not to act out. In other families, a parent might give a child a paddling on the rear end. My mother, a Holocaust survivor, wouldn't do any of those things. When I made a big mess or tried to flush the transistor radio down the toilet, my mother would work herself into a frenzy, erupt in tears, and start to scream at me. "I can't take it," she'd shout. "I wish I were dead. Why did I survive? Why didn't Hitler kill me?" My father, a former resistance fighter and Buchenwald death camp survivor, had gone through comparable trauma. He and my mother met as refugees soon after the war had ended, and for the rest of their lives experienced most life events together. And yet, they responded differently, he always being full of optimism and self-confidence. Why did my parents react to events in such varied ways? More generally, what are emotions? Why do we have them? And how do they arise in our brains? How do they affect our thoughts, judgments, motivation, and decisions? And how can we control them?
Wow, that's incredibly powerful and fascinating, right? I mean, we know that different people have different emotional reactions to the same circumstances. I wonder why that is.
Yeah, and does it suggest that we can manipulate our emotional responses? Like, if you're able to react to a stressful situation without getting stressed, can I figure out how to do the same thing?
Exactly. Are we at the mercy of our emotions, or can we master them somehow? Annie and Len tackle that question right after the break.
Hey, I'm Michael Kovnat, host of The Next Big Idea Daily. The show is a masterclass in better living from some of the smartest writers around. Every morning, Monday through Friday, we'll serve up a quick 10-minute lesson on how to strengthen your relationships, supercharge your creativity, boost your productivity, and more. Follow The Next Big Idea Daily wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey folks, Rufus here. If you're a fan of our interviews with physicians, scientists, or entrepreneurs, then I have the perfect podcast recommendation for you, Raising Health. Previously called BioEats World, Raising Health comes from leading venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz, A16Z. Each episode, Raising Health dives deep into the heart of healthcare, biotech, and AI with A16Z General Partners. Along the way, they explore the real challenges and opportunities in health and biotech entrepreneurship. Not to mention, you'll hear raw insights and actionable advice from notable guests like Omada CEO and co-founder Sean Duffy, and AI expert and In-Sitro CEO Daphne Kohler. Don't miss out. Follow Raising Health wherever you get your podcasts.
What would you say to those readers who feel at the mercy of their emotions? You know, that they can understand on an intellectual level that, as you say, emotions are functional states, but in the moment, none of us like to feel bad, you know, sad or angry or upset or frustrated. I mean, what do we do with negative emotions like that feel bad to experience, unpleasant to experience? Can we think about them in a new way, given what we're learning about the functionality of emotions?
Well, first of all, there's a lot to say there. First of all, they are useful. Even when you're feeling sad or angry, fearful, those are useful. Those emotions have developed in order to get you to take actions that will improve your situation. So when you're in a sad state, for example, you're in a state where you're more motivated to change things, to change whatever your circumstances are. Whereas otherwise you might let something that's unoptimal keep going. When you're sad about it, you tend to change it. So part of it is just recognizing that this is useful and this is helping you. If you feel that it's persisting too long or that it's too strong, then there are ways that you can handle that where you can try to change your emotion using your conscience, your executive function of your frontal lobe. You can try and alter your emotional experience, which largely comes from unconscious processes. But you can do that, and that's what's called regulation. For example, a simple example is I'm driving down the street, and somebody cuts me off, right? It's not something that really, you develop, anger developed as an emotion in order to help motivate you to fix things when somebody gets in the way of you and your goals. In modern life, I would say getting cut off in traffic isn't really getting in the way of your goal in any non-negligible way, but it makes us angry anyway. And there's nothing, then there's no action probably no appropriate action no action that's appropriate that you should take in that situation, honking or whatever, yelling, giving someone the finger. None of that is really a good thing. So what do you do from the point of view of regulation? There's one type of strategy called reappraisal. Reappraisal comes from the word appraisal. Appraisal has to do with how your brain constructs your emotional experience based on the situation and the context. And your brain, in this case, constructed anger based on this person cutting you off. And there are some assumptions that you're making unconsciously that make it go into anger, which is that the person is a bad person, is disrespecting you, is treating, as being an ass, or is being nasty to you in some way, and is hurting you in some way. And I said earlier, you're not really being hurt by having your car pull back 20 feet or whatever. And those other aspects of it about the person being evil are just a story that you told. So reappraisal means spinning it differently to have your brain come up with a different appraisal. So you just remind yourself, well, maybe that person is late. You've all been late, and we've been desperate to get somewhere at some time. Maybe that's what's going on. Maybe then you'll have more sympathy or empathy for the person, and you won't be angry. Maybe the person is just an oblivious type, and I know I often am. I'm thinking about something, and then I change lanes and don't realize that I just cut someone off, right? If you think that, you probably won't be angry or as angry either. So the idea of the reappraisal method is to take whatever situation is and now consciously try and find another explanation for it. It has to be one that you buy. I mean, you can't just say, I'm going to choose to think of it this way, even though I don't believe it. Then it won't work. But if you think about other possible explanations, then your mind will automatically diffuse that other emotion and take your feeling in a different direction. So that's one thing you can do. It's called reappraisal.
Yeah, Len, that's making me think of a really interesting idea you raised in your book, which is this emerging model of the brain as like a prediction machine. Like it's always sort of predicting what it thinks will happen and then checking what actually happens against that prediction. And I had never thought about that predictive processing model in relation to emotion, but it made sense once I started to think about how people often have emotional scripts drawn from their own experiences that lead them to expect certain kinds of emotional experiences in the future. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about how that predictive function of emotion works and whether it would be possible to change those predictions.
That's a good question. So if you think about what is the brain for, so let's just think about how we evolved from single-celled organisms, right? As we became multicellular, we became more sophisticated and started to have sensors that could sense either the chemical environment or the heat around us, and eventually sights and sounds. And we began, as we became multicellular, to have cells or structures that had the function of being able to move us around. That's what legs and wings and so forth are today in more developed animals. So our brain had to have a way of, well, in order for this stuff to be useful, we needed a processor now, a central processor that takes in the sensory input, understands what's going on, and then orders our limbs or our wings or whatever to do something appropriate in that situation based on the sensory input and based on the processing. So if you think about it, if all we're doing is reacting to the situation at this particular moment, then we have a disadvantage compared to some other being that actually looks, I'm not talking about looks ahead a year or a month or a week, seconds or a minute ahead, right? And that is evolutionarily favored because you can prevent a lot of bad things from happening if you just look ahead a little bit. So let's say I'm walking. If I wait till I'm on the cliff and I'm about to take my next step and fall off to react, that's not so good. But if my brain is predicting if I keep going in this direction, I'm going to fall off the cliff, I can stop that ahead of time. So our brain has evolved to do that. And again, I'm not talking about determining where the stock market's going in a month. I'm talking about determining what will happen to me in the next few seconds if I keep doing what I'm doing. Or if a bear appears, I'm looking into the future. That bear might be hungry and want to eat me. So our brains are constantly trying to predict the future. And what do you suppose they would use as the basis of their predictions? Well, what else what does a brain have? It has its memories, your knowledge of the world. It also has your belief system, right? And that can vary from person to person. In the same environment, they have different beliefs. And it takes into account your goals as well. So your brain is using all that information to predict what's going to happen next. And this is very closely connected to your feelings about what happened. So whatever it becomes the most amplified of your memories or of your experiences or of your beliefs depends on your emotional state and your past emotional experiences when you were experiencing those memories. So this means that our past can greatly affect how we assess present situations. And again, here's where my mother comes in, for example, as a very good illustration. And she was 16 when the World War II broke out, and as I said, lost everything, and including her older sister, whom she was very close to. And what that did to her was put her in a kind of a frozen, pessimistic state, where whatever happens, she would interpret it in a scary, bad way. She was living in constant anxiety. Anxiety is an emotion that is connected to they call it a pessimistic cognitive bias. What that means is anxious people tend to interpret events in a bad way. If I see a mole on my skin and I'm an anxious person, I might immediately think that must be cancer. If I'm very low anxiety, I may just ignore it. Anxiety is a useful emotion because sometimes it is cancer, and if you go get it checked out, that's good. And if you have no anxiety, that's not good. When they study the lifespans of anxious people with very high anxiety have shorter lifespans, but so do people with low anxiety. So my mother was in a constant state where she really needed to exercise regulation, of anxiety, to the point where when I was in graduate school, I had a roommate, and I talked to my mother at 8:00 every Thursday night. And one night I went out with this woman on a date, and so I didn't call. I forgot that it was time to call, and so she calls my roommate and says, where's Len? My roommate says, he's out. He's out on a date somewhere. And then my mother calls back in a half hour. Is he home yet? And then she says, no, he's not home yet. Well, why? It's not unusual. Why wouldn't he have called me to tell me? And then she would call back in 10 more minutes and go, come on, I know something happened. He would have called me by now. He wouldn't just forget. And then she started calling time after time, and eventually said, okay, she called me Lenny, by the way. So she said, hey, I know Lenny died. You can't hide it from me. I'm going to find out. Just tell me what happened to him. And my roommate went, whoa, and whatever, took the phone off the hook. And when I got home that night, she said, whoa, what's with your mother? And the thing about my mother was that is an extreme pessimistic cognitive bias. She has the same data that your mother would have had, and maybe accepted that I forgot to call or forgot it, but she reads the data differently because in her life, guess what? This stuff did happen. This is not beyond the pale. This is not absurd. You probably might be thinking, oh my God, what a nut. She wasn't a nut at all. This was her previous experience of what happened in the world.
Good news for you geeks out there. According to a recent study from the Yale University School of Public Health, people who read books for at least 30 minutes a day live nearly 2 years longer than non-readers. 2 years. But finding that time is not easy, which is why more and more of us are listening to books so we can take advantage of the time we spend driving, gardening, doing the dishes, taking a shower. Seriously, I have listened to books and podcasts in the shower. Am I not the only one? What if I told you there was an easier way to extend your life by reading books? Well, friends, there is the Next Big Idea app. Download it and you'll find 12-minute audio summaries of the very best new books read to you by the authors themselves. Listen to 2 a day. You'll get the key insights from 2 brilliant new books directly from the world's leading thinkers. And in the process, you might just add 2 years to your lifespan. We call these summaries book bites. There are hundreds of them in our app, and we're adding new ones every single day. And get this, other book summary apps summarize books without the author's permission. So it's missing the heart and soul of the author. We work with the world's leading authors to make our book bites because we want to give you the genuine article and help authors succeed in the process. A book bite a day keeps the doctor away. See for yourself. Download the Next Big Idea app now. Actually, right now, pause this recording, go to your app store, and search for Next Big Idea. Get smart, live longer. Download the Next Big Idea app right now.
Welcome back to the show. Oh, I've always wanted to say that. So one of the questions that's coming up for me, Rufus, as we listen back to this is on this idea that our brains are kind of predicting what's going to happen to us, and that can trigger emotion. So, if we get some sensory data that tells us we should be afraid, we very quickly transition to that fear-based state. What I don't get is why every single time it needs to feel so scary.
So interesting. I had the same question in my mind. I think Len would say, as would Antonio Damasio, I think, with whom we had a great conversation a few months back, his work on the evolution of feelings overlaps quite a bit here. They would say that fear needs to increase your pulse and sharpen your attention to prepare you for a threat. And that feeling may be less pleasant than your previously happily oblivious state. I think Len would also point out that while the spectrum of our emotions is incredibly nuanced, think, for example, about the difference between the fear of getting rained on and the fear of drowning. The mind-body connection through which we experience those emotions isn't nuanced at all. He writes about something called core affect. It's older and more primitive than emotion. Len describes it as kind of like a thermometer, but for our general well-being. And core affect is pretty crude. It only has two aspects. One of them is valence, how pleasant or unpleasant is what you're experiencing right now. And the other is arousal, how intense is that pleasantness or unpleasantness. Because core affect is tied to your physical well-being, it can be a kind of binary trigger. So, for instance, if you win the lottery and then 5 minutes later you stub your toe, your core affect is going to say, who cares about winning the lottery? My big toe hurts.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, look, it also, you're probably better off having an outsized emotional response that could potentially save your life. If that stubbing of the big toe is actually something, potentially a fatal wound, you'd probably rather overreact to that because all the money you just won from the lottery doesn't really mean anything if you're going to bleed out to death or whatever. Well, let's get back to the conversation because they're about to do something really interesting. Is they're going to zoom out a little bit from, we're talking about sort of emotions on the individual level, but emotions can be felt socially. So let's hear what they have to say about that.
Len, I realize we've been talking about emotions as if they're purely sort of individual phenomena, but really our emotions are experienced socially. We often, share them with other people. Other people are affected by our emotions. I mean, do you have any thoughts about that social element?
Right. So that's another huge area to talk about. Social emotions develop because human beings living in the wild were really not viable. We became viable when we banded together. So maybe 5 of us together could, run down the mastodon or whatever, or fend off the lion, or build a shelter, but not individuals. So that we lived in these groups. And in order for the groups to have smooth interactions, we needed to be able to have certain emotions, certain social cooperative emotions. You have emotions like awe, excitement. You have negative emotions like jealousy, shame, and guilt. What are they for? Well, they're all to help us work together. You feel guilt when you violated the social norms and injured somebody. That developed to encourage people to work together. You have shame when other people say that about you. You've done this that was violated social norms and you hurt people. Then you feel shame. And these are all there to help us work together. And so, of course, those kinds of emotions are things that we tend to share and that happen in social situations. And they're very important. I talk in the book about what happens when you don't have any of that. Now, some people are fine and they learn consciously how to behave and how they're supposed to act toward people. Other people don't learn that or don't care about that, and they do horrible things. And they can do horrible things like mass murders because they don't feel empathy, they feel no shame, they feel no guilt. If you don't feel any of these emotions, then why treat a human as a human? So that's why we need to have those social emotions.
Right. Yeah, that's another way in which emotions are really so important and sometimes overlooked. Well, I think we're getting to our time here, Len. So thank you so much for talking with me about your book. It's really a wonderful book, and I recommend it to anyone.
Thanks, Annie. Thanks for a great conversation. And yeah, and I like your books too.
Thanks.
All right, Rufus, are you ready to hear your questionnaire results?
I'm a little apprehensive, but yes, go ahead, Caleb.
Okay, well, I should say, I don't think I said this at the top, that this is a survey that was designed at the University of Oxford, so it's very sophisticated. And so the average score is 115. You scored 135, which means you're, quote, highly susceptible to happiness. I think that means, from the things Len was talking about, you're actually at low risk for road rage. I'm not sure how often you need to be applying reappraisal because maybe you should reappraise things because you're approaching them with too much glee.
Caleb, I would like full disclosure. I do sometimes get frustrated behind the wheel. But I'm a little concerned that Susan Cain, who was just on the show, would not approve of my high susceptibility to happiness. I worry a little bit that excessive happiness might be a sign that I'm simply not discerning enough about everything that's wrong with the world. Is that possible?
Yeah, it's true. Maybe you need to have a little more judgment, a little more taste.
Yeah, I'm missing some of the clear evidence that the world is really messed up and inadequate. Well, I encourage anyone who wants to better understand how their feelings shape their thinking to pick up a copy of Emotional. And why not grab a copy of The Extended Mind by Annie Murphy Paul while you're at it? You could also download the Next Big Idea app and hear Annie and Len summarize both of their books in 12 minutes flat. And you will also find there Antonio Damasio summarizing his recent book, Feeling and Knowing. If you're a visual learner, check out the terrific e-course Annie also made based on The Extended Mind, which you can only find in our app. Go to your app store and search for Next Big Idea. What better time than now? We'd love to welcome you into our community of lifelong learners. If you like this show, please tell your friends, in-laws, Uber drivers, cashiers at Starbucks, and leave us a rating and a review. It really does help us get the word out. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the Next Big Idea app, or wherever you're listening right now. Our executive producers are Caleb Bissinger and Michael Kovnat. Sound designed by Woodland Audio. Working with LinkedIn makes us feel all the feelings. I'm your host, Rufus Griscom. See you next week.